21st of March 2023. This skidmark is something that I really don't have a topic or a theme for it. It is just something that I felt like talking about. The skidmarks that I did in the past few days got a few interesting comments, and I got a few interesting messages. I had a few interesting phone calls about it. We as white South Africans have got a problem, and the Afrikaner specifically has got a bigger problem. Afrikaners are around about 2.5 million people out of a population of 60 million. So we are a small group, but we are also fairly divided. And I've done skidmarks about the characteristics of the Afrikaner and the traits of the Afrikaner. But the reality is that we've got a major problem. And it is not only a problem for us. The problem is that our traditional values, our traditional conservative Christian values are under attack and is being trampled on by the government. And it's being trampled on by the DA. And Afrikaners has got a tendency to vote along traditional lines. And all were working well in the days of the National Party because you didn't have to think a lot about where you're going to vote. But today in South Africa, that's a different story. And the world is changing. That is very important. The world is changing. The world order is changing. And that has put us into a crazy place. We've landed in a place where with our eyes we can see a leader is good for a country and is doing well for his people. But instinctively we're against him because he's a communist or he's a dictator or something like that. We have to change that. We have to work on ourselves to change that. And now many of you wonder, why the hell am I doing this one in English? I'm doing it in English specifically because there are people that don't understand Afrikaans, that feels the same way as we feel. And that is why I've done this thing in English. And now you must forgive me. I'm going to just start the show by showing you two leaders which are going to make many people frown. But these two guys that you see on the screen there, they are actually the most important two leaders today in the world. And I can imagine the frowns and the words and things when I say something like that, but you must just understand. The guy on the left has got the biggest nuclear armament collection in the world. The guy on the right himself has got a very substantial nuclear armament, but the guy on the left has got most of the natural resources that the world needs. And he's a major player in the oil market, and metals market, and he's a major exporter of grain, plus he's the biggest producer of fertilizers. The guy on the right has got an industrial capacity that is bigger than the US and Europe combined. Let that sink in. Plus, these two guys are drawing the populations and governments of Africa, South America, Central America, Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, Middle East, everywhere, from everywhere. Between them, their, let's call it friends, represents more than 80% of the world's population. Let that sink in. So, I say again, these are politically the most important guys on the block today. And both of them has got one big advantage. They never colonized other countries. So nobody can accuse them of imperialism. And imperialism has become a swear word among Africa and South America, and in the East as well. Now, the other thing is this. In the past 3 weeks, Xi Jinping has suddenly popped up to the top of the rank as an honest broker when it comes to diplomatic issues. He resolved the issue between Iran and Saudi, which is a big thing, and there is now spin-offs from that. Between him and Putin, the Arab world is taking Syria back into their fold, and it looks like the Arabs are beginning to unite. Now, all of that is bad news for the US and the West. But I want you to think again about these two leaders. And unfortunately, our South African guys, we South Africans, has got a problem. Many of us has got a Moorse problem with these two guys, with both. The one on the right is a communist, and the one on the left is accused of being a communist, although he's not a communist. So, but it's all bullshit. You must think about it. Listen to what this guy said, what this says here. China is ready to join forces with Russia to defend its national interest, according to a Chinese diplomat. The People's Republic of China is ready to join forces with Russia to decisively stand up for national interest and promote mutually beneficial cooperation in all areas. Let that sink in. Now you must forgive me, I'm going to read now from a document that I typed out because I was not comfortable to freewheel this one. We live in a time where information is fairly accessible, but that also creates the opportunity for misinformation. My generation, I was born in 1952, grew up in South Africa where the rooi gevaar, red danger, was hammered into our heads daily, every day. We waged a war against the communists in Angola, and many people lost their lives. So naturally, the white population by large actually hate communists. The reality is that we waged a war against Cuban soldiers in Angola and Angola troops with Russian advisors. Direct conflict between our soldiers and the Russians were actually rare. But the Russians were there. Naturally, we hated Russians because they were communists. Some Afrikaners are brutally against the Russians because of the Angola war. But they either forget or are unaware that the Russians assisted and fought with Afrikaners against the British in the Anglo-Boer War. Yes, the Russians helped the Boer. Then the USSR collapsed, and with it, the communist rule of Russia. All of us took note of the first thing, the collapse of the USSR, but very few absorbed the second reality, the collapse of communism. Incidentally, at that stage, South Africa was one of the best working socialist countries in the world. Let that sink in. Yes, socialist, but masked very well by a mask of democracy and capitalism. But in the core, it was socialist. Our lives were very regulated, and news media were tightly controlled. Only approved information could make it onto the papers. Who can forget the battles of Max de Pree and his Vrye Weekblad? The constant battles between the NP and the Sunday Times and the Star. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but let me just put this on the table. At a stage of my life, part of my responsibilities were to scan newspapers. That's all I'm going to say. The Afrikaans churches played their part, and our society was happy with the status quo. Meanwhile, the Russians went through hell. With the collapse of the communist rule, harsh economic realities hit the population. Unemployment was rife. The state no longer owned everything and could no longer provide an income to everybody. The oligarchs were born, and the Western capitalists, multinationals, plundered the resources of Russia, with all the profits going to the West and made Russia poorer. Then came Putin, and he started rebuilding, drove the plunderers out and started structuring the economy. He nationalized their central bank, threw the Rothschilds out. He nationalized a hell of a lot of the oil companies that were created and set up as the USSR collapsed. So he re-nationalized a lot of those things. And he started looking at the infrastructure of Russia and the social well-being of the people. Yeah, they've got strict rules and that, but for you as a South African, that shouldn't be strange, because we were under similar strange, strict controls. Very strict. The reality is, in my days, guys went to jail for things that they said. And take my word for it. Things that they said. You dare to differ from the regime, and you start publishing it. You start singing about it. You start making poetry about it. You very quickly you were in deep shit. I know. For that, what Putin did, the West and the Western media never give him credit. On the other side, China was rising, and the stupid Greens and corrupt politicians in the USA drove American industries to China because they were exploiting cheap labor and they didn't worry about pollution. And today, the Chinese economy is very strong, and their industrial capacity is, as I've said, more than the US and Europe combined. And the Ukraine war has highlighted the fact that the West has lost their industrial capacity. Too late for tears. Once again, to the average Afrikaner, this does not matter because China is a communist party. Traditionally, we are Western biased, and there are many reasons for it. Notwithstanding the fact that it was the West that ultimately destroyed our country. Many still support and are committed to the West because the West is democratic. What a fucking joke. And you must believe me, I've got people that tell me the West is democratic and Russia is communist and a dictatorship. It's things like that. Let's look at a few horrific instances where the West brought democracy to a country. Libya. Gaddafi tamed that country where tribes were forever in conflict. He tamed it with brute force. Yes, he was a dictator, but he tamed the country and Libya bloomed. Citizens were happy and got great benefits from the oil wealth. Free education up to varsity level. Free medical services, everything. When a couple gets married, the state gave them a house and a car. When their children are born, they get a child grant, a substantial, decent child grant. And that is just a few things. I've got a long list of the things that Libya gave to their citizens. The economy was growing and people were employed. It took a dictator to tame the barbarians. Then the West brought democracy, killed Gaddafi, and destroyed the country, bombed it into oblivion. Years later, the place is still a hellhole, but the West is pumping the oil like hell. Same story happened in Iraq. They tried the same in Syria, but could not remove Assad. They are stealing currently. The Americans are stealing 80% of Syrians' oil production. Think about that. That is democracy. Now the tide is turning. The democratic West destroyed Afghanistan and Yemen and finances all the terrorist groups in the Middle East to maintain instability. But China is changing that. Communist China is changing that. Now we have a problem. We are seeing what the West is doing, but we are committed to the West. The Western media hammers us daily with the idea that the West, democracy, are good and anything else is bad. So we are actually following an ideology and not logic. It is a fallacy that democracy, Western style, is the best system. It is clear now that it is inherently corrupt, immoral, and brutal. But still, communists or dictators are evil. By the way, anything that differs from Western democracy is a dictatorship in the eyes of many people. Now think about it. If communism in China was really so bad, why does that 1.6 billion people not revolt? Don't tell me that the regime keeps them under control. No regime can control 1.6 billion angry people. Fidel Castro toppled the Cuban regime with 27 men. Let that sink in. 27 men. Think about it. Now with the Ukraine war, we have a serious problem. By supporting Zelensky, by definition, we are supporting Nazis, a dictator that has banned the language of the majority of the citizens, banned all opposition parties, banned the Christian church, banned free media, but the media hides all of this and focus on the Russians and Putin that is bad. Meanwhile, 14,000 Russians were killed by the good Ukrainian troops. Think about that. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries on earth. Yet we must support it because that is what the West tells us to do. You sit here in South Africa. The government system in China or in Russia is not material to you. You don't have to live under that government. But the leaders of those countries are clearly working for the best for their people and their countries. They do things that secure their people and grow their economies. They want to have trade relations with South Africa, and that is it. They don't want to change our government or set up a military bases here. They don't want you to fight wars for them. Now your brain is scrambled. You have to hate them, but it makes no sense. And you revert to your basic safe spot, denial. Unfortunately, denial is not going to fly in today's world. There are too many sources of information, and your safe space is under constant invasion. All over Africa, China is financing major infrastructure projects, roads, rail, airports, harbors. Yes, financing actual projects, not like the West that give massive loans to corrupt governments. And then, how many generations of our children will pay the interest on those loans? And where is that capital? Definitely not in infrastructure. And then is these guys that they make this story, yes, the Chinese controls the harbor if they build a harbor. Now let me explain to you how that works. China makes deals with these countries for raw materials, be it mined materials or timber or whatever. But those things need to be transported to China. To get it to China, it needs to end up on a ship. For the ships, they need a harbor. To transport the stuff to the harbor, they need roads and rail. So the Chinese says to that government, we will build the harbor, and we are going to control that harbor and manage that harbor. And a portion of the fees that is raised in that harbor will go off against your loan, the capital loan to build the harbor. Once that loan is settled, the harbor is yours. And they do that with roads, they do it with rails, they do it with bridges, they do it with buildings. That's how they operate. So they get their investment back by operating these things. And once the investment loan has been covered, the asset reverts to the country. And then China has got an annual budget of loans that they write off in the African countries. Today in Moscow, Russia has told the African people that are there for that meeting of African leaders that Moscow is writing off $20 billion of debt. Think about that. The West doesn't do that. No, the West loans more so they can get more interest and get the country deeper into the debt pit. Russia is doing business with commodities that Africa needs. Fuel, fertilizer, food. And in many instances, Russia gives serious discounts to the poor nations. Russia has in the past 2 weeks, I think, donated a hell of a lot of fertilizer to Malawi. Yes, PMC Wagner is operating in some countries. But guess what? They are fighting the terrorists that the West is arming and financing and using to destabilize governments. That is what Wagner is doing in Africa. So, you as a white South African need to rethink your position. You need to accept that you have been abused by the Western narrative. And you have been lied to. Take stock and be honest. What are the West actually doing that improves your daily life? The West has destroyed basically all our industries. Why? Because they only want our raw materials so that they can make the money from processing it. Biden gave Ramaphosa billions for what? To go green so the West can have our coal. And at the same time, our power stations struggles and collapses, and we've got energy shortages that fuck our industries up further. Plus, many generations of our descendants will pay the interest on all the loans. Where are the loans? In some offshore bank accounts. Not in mines, not in plants, not in roads, not in rail. All part of the WEF globalist plan. Time to think about the future. The DA became an only option to most whites because they have white leadership and administrate well. But, and it's a big but, they are totally committed to the WEF agenda and indebted to the globalists. The ANC and EFF are obviously out. Action SA don't really appeal to whites for a variety of reasons. For one, Mashaba's vendetta with the DA makes him get embroiled in racist shit that is totally uncalled for, but reveals a flaw. In my mind, as a South African white, I have two options, ACDP or Freedom Front Plus. You make the choice. Liberal whites will never go for any one of those two. They will stick to the DA, because that is where they will feel comfortable. Think about this. Most countries in Africa, Middle East and Asia, Russia and China rejects this gender shit. Why is the West so committed to it? Because it serves their mission to destroy families. Here in South Africa, the only party that really openly promotes it is the DA. The DA wants you to believe that they are the only real opposition to the ANC. That is only because they want you to believe that there is safety in numbers and vote for them. But what is your vote going to bring you? More WEF plans for you without you ever having a say in it. Remember how fanatically they followed the JAB plan. They are openly antagonistic towards Russia and China, and by definition BRICS. Why? Because BRICS will be the end of the G7 and G20, and with it the Western imperialism and USA hegemony. Why are Africans in this? We are Africans, and this is our homeland. Africa is changing course, and we are on that boat. The DA wants you to jump ship, and then, where will you land? So, my advice to you is to rinse your brain, flush your preconceived ideas about the non-West, and look for opportunities. Believe me, there will be. What we need is to rid ourselves of the ANC. In my mind, the only real option is to get the republic broken up. Those smaller independent states can then associate with who and what they want. Chances are that those states will find a lot of goodwill in the so-called global south, and nothing but threats and takeovers in the West. But that is a dream. To imagine that Russia supports the ANC is a fallacy. Russia respects all governments and don't interfere or prescribes. Our biggest danger is if a DA majority coalition takes over, because then BRICS' tickets and the globalists will devour our country. The only way to really mitigate that is to ensure that the coalition partners are themselves substantial enough to keep the DA under control. How can we do that? By making sure, if you're against the WEF agenda, to vote for either the Freedom Front Plus or the ACDP. The next election, you need to bury your petty principles and vote strategic. You may not like everything of the Freedom Front Plus, but at least you know they are less corrupt than the top three. They are decent people and have good leadership. More important, they are not immoral. Don't listen to the DA bullshit that you waste your vote on a smaller party. We have seen where the DA's loyalties and obligations are. I'm going to end this and say again, Russia is not communists, and you need to rethink your definition of democracy. Democracy, like in the West, is not good per se. Look at how the so-called democratic elected leaders of the USA, UK and EU have fucked those countries up in the past few years. Think about that. Then look at Putin and Xi and see what they have done for their countries. One more time, Putin is not a communist. So PW is not going to be upset with you if you like Putin. On the other hand, Steenhuis will be very upset. And on that note, I'm going to end this. This was a bloody long one. But please, give me a like, and a subscribe, and share the thing.